I swear, if you had been there, you'd understand why this still makes my skin crawl. It was just supposed to be a regular evening, a bunch of us hanging out, trying to have some fun before school started back up. But it turned into something else, something that none of us could forget. It was one of those heavy summer evenings, the kind where the air feels thick and the sun lingers on the horizon, casting everything in this strange golden light. We were out at the edge of town, near that old abandoned house. You know the one I'm talking about, right? The one everyone says is haunted, but no one really takes seriously. At least not until you're actually standing near it. The house has been there forever, as long as I can remember, all falling apart and covered in ivy, with those shattered windows that look like eyes watching you. The kind of place kids dare each other to run up to on Halloween. There were 5 of us that day. Me, Tommy, Sarah, Luke, and Maria. We had been down by the creek earlier, skipping rocks and talking about whatever came to mind. But then Luke, being Luke, suggested we head over to the abandoned house. He said something about how we should make the summer count, and of course, no one wanted to be the one to back down. We weren't planning on going inside or anything, just hanging around, making stupid jokes, seeing if we could freak each other out a little. When we got there, the sun was just starting to set, and the whole place had this eerie glow, the light hitting the windows just right so they reflected back like a mirror, making it impossible to see inside. The yard was overgrown with tall grass and weeds, and the gate, which was hanging on by a single hinge, creaked as we squeezed through it. The air smelled kind of sour, like mildew and damp earth, and the whole area felt colder, even though it was still hot everywhere else. We spread out around the front yard, Tommy tossing pebbles at the broken windows, Maria daring Luke to touch the front door. It was just regular kid stuff, you know? Just a bunch of teenagers trying to look brave in front of each other. But there was this weird tension, like we were all waiting for something to happen, even though we'd never admit it. And then it did. It started with a noise, a loud, echoing thud coming from somewhere inside the house. We all froze, every one of us, eyes snapping toward the broken windows. The sound was heavy, like something had fallen or been knocked over, and it was followed by a moment of dead silence, where even the wind seemed to stop. I remember feeling this cold sensation wash over me, like the blood in my veins had turned to ice. What was that? Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. Tommy laughed, but it came out forced. Probably just the wind, right? He looked around, but no one answered. We were all staring at the windows, the ones that were dark now, with the sun slipping lower, leaving the house in shadow. And that's when they came. The bats. It was like an explosion. Thousands of them, bursting out of one of the upstairs windows. The noise was deafening, a mix of high-pitched squeaks and the frantic flapping of wings. They poured out in this endless stream, a black mass against the dimming sky, swirling and diving as they scattered into the evening air. I remember ducking instinctively, throwing my arms over my head and hearing Sarah scream beside me. The sound, that flurry of wings and screeching, was everywhere, surrounding us. It felt like the whole world had turned into chaos. I could feel the rush of air as they flew past, the breeze from their wings whipping at my face. We all stumbled back, almost tripping over each other in our scramble to get away from the house, from whatever had startled them. After what felt like forever, the bats finally disappeared into the trees, and everything went quiet again. The silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been, and I remember just standing there, breathing hard, my heart pounding like it was going to break through my chest. Luke was the first to speak, his voice shaky. "Did you guys see that? What the hell was that?" We all mumbled something, trying to laugh it off, but you could tell none of us were really okay. It wasn't just the bats, it was the way they had come out, like something had driven them out, scared them. And then there was that thud we heard before, the one that had set everything off. We should have left then. We should have just turned and run, gone back to town, and never looked back. But instead, we stood there, staring at that house. I think part of us wanted to prove we weren't scared, that we could handle it. Or maybe we just couldn't look away, like we were waiting for something more to happen. Tommy, still trying to be brave, started toward the front porch. "Come on, let's just check it out," he said, though his voice was thin, almost cracking. "It's probably just animals or something. Nothing to be freaked out about." "Tommy, no," Sarah said, her eyes wide. She looked genuinely scared, and that was enough to make me uneasy. Sarah was the practical one, the one who usually calmed us down when things got out of hand. But Tommy was already at the porch, his hand on the railing. He gave us this look, like he was daring us to follow him, and Luke, always the one to take a dare, walked up behind him. I didn't want to be left standing there alone with Maria and Sarah, so I took a deep breath and followed, even though every instinct in me was screaming to turn around. The porch creaked under our weight, the wood soft and rotting in places. The door was cracked open, just a sliver, and as we got closer, I could see the darkness inside, thick and impenetrable. The air smelled worse here, like something rotten, something that had been left to decay for years. Tommy pushed the door a little, and it swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty rooms beyond. I didn't want to go in. I could see the entryway, the old wallpaper peeling from the walls, the floor covered in dust and debris. The light from outside barely penetrated the gloom, and everything inside looked warped, like the shadows were moving, shifting just out of sight. But Tommy stepped inside, and then Luke, and before I knew it, I was following, my feet moving almost on their own. The inside of the house was worse than I expected. It was cold, much colder than outside, and the air felt heavy, almost thick. I could hear every breath I took, echoing in the silence, and the floor creaked with each step, the sound reverberating off the walls. There was furniture, old and broken, covered in dust, and a staircase leading up to the second floor, where the bats had come from. I stared at it, feeling that same chill run down my spine. "What do you think made that noise?" Luke asked, his voice low. He was trying to sound casual, but I could hear the edge of fear in it. Tommy shrugged, though he looked pale. "Probably just something falling over," he said, but even he didn't seem convinced. We made our way deeper into the house, stepping over broken boards and pieces of shattered glass. The further we went, the worse the feeling got, like the air itself was pressing down on us, like something was watching. I could feel it, this sense of being observed, of eyes on me from somewhere in the dark. We stopped in what must have once been the living room. There was an old, torn-up sofa and a fireplace with a blackened hearth. Above the fireplace was a mirror, cracked down the middle, the glass smeared with something dark. I remember staring at it, the way the crack seemed to split my reflection in two, making me look distorted, wrong. And then we heard it again. A noise from upstairs, a thud, louder this time, like something heavy being dragged. My head snapped up toward the ceiling, and I saw the dust shake loose, drifting down in the faint light. Sarah, who had finally followed us in with Maria, grabbed my arm. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice urgent. "We shouldn't be here." For once, I agreed with her. "Tommy, let's just go, okay?" I said, turning to him. But he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the stairs, his eyes wide, his face pale. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it, a figure, at the top of the stairs, just barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, almost like it had been stretched. I couldn't see its face, just the outline, dark against the dim light coming through the broken window behind it. It stood there, completely still, just watching us. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt, my vision narrowing until all I could see was that shape, that impossibly still shape at the top of the stairs. It was like time had frozen. No one moved, no one even seemed to breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no explanation that fit. It was like a nightmare, one of those dreams where you try to scream, try to run, but your body just won't move. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was Sarah, or maybe it was Maria grabbing Sarah's arm, but suddenly we were all stumbling back, bumping into each other, shuffling away from the staircase. Tommy, who had been trying so hard to look brave, had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. He turned and bolted for the door, and that was all it took for the rest of us to follow. I could hear my own breath, ragged and shallow, the pounding of my feet on the dusty wooden floor, the creaking of the old boards as we ran. Luke was right behind me, his hand brushing against my shoulder as we scrambled for the front door. The house felt like it was closing in on us, the walls narrowing, the air thickening, pressing in. I swear I could hear something behind us, like soft, deliberate footsteps coming down the stairs, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see whatever it was that was following us. We burst out onto the porch, the evening air hitting me like a slap in the face. It was dark now. The last light of the sunset had faded, leaving only the pale glow of the moon casting long shadows across the yard. We didn't stop running until we were well past the gate, out into the overgrown yard, panting and gasping for breath. Tommy, who had reached the gate first, was doubled over, his hands on his knees. "Did you see that?" He managed to get out, his voice barely above a whisper. What was that thing?" None of us answered. I don't think any of us knew what to say. I turned to look back at the house, my eyes scanning the dark windows. They looked empty now, just hollow, lifeless holes in the crumbling facade. But I knew what I had seen. We all did. And the worst part was, I knew it had seen us too. Maria was crying, her face pale, her hands shaking as she held on to Sarah. "We should have never come here," she said, her voice cracking. "We need to leave. Now." I couldn't agree more. We turned, making our way back down the path that led away from the house, the gravel crunching under our feet. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind rustling through the tall grass and the distant echo of the creek somewhere far off. The silence between us was heavy, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had just witnessed. And then, as we reached the edge of the property, we heard it again, that sound. A loud, echoing thud like something falling inside the house. We all froze, turning to look back. My heart pounded in my chest, my stomach twisting in knots. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see if that figure was still there. But I couldn't help it. My eyes were drawn to the house, to the dark silhouette against the night sky. For a moment, everything was still. And then, from one of the upstairs windows, the same one the bats had flown out of earlier, I saw something move. A shape, dark and twisted, shifting just behind the broken glass. It was quick, almost too quick to see, but it was there and it was enough. Without saying a word, we all turned and ran, our feet pounding against the ground, the sound of our breath echoing in the night. We didn't stop until we were back in town, standing under the streetlights, the familiar glow bathing us in a warmth that almost felt like safety. We were panting, out of breath, our faces pale, our hands trembling. No one said anything for a long time. Finally, Tommy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't talk about this. Not to anyone." No one argued. It was like an unspoken agreement. We just wanted to forget, to pretend it had never happened. But I knew, even then, that I wouldn't be able to. I knew I'd see that figure in my dreams, that I'd hear those footsteps in the quiet of the night, that I'd feel that cold, watching presence every time I closed my eyes. We went our separate ways that night, each of us heading home in silence. I remember getting back to my room, locking the door, and sitting on my bed, staring at the wall, trying to convince myself it was all just some elaborate prank, something my mind had conjured up because of the dark, the tension, the stories we'd all heard about that house. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It felt too real, every detail, every sound, every chilling sensation. I barely slept that night, and when I did, I dreamed of the house, of that staircase, the dark figure, the way it just stood there watching us. I could feel its eyes on me even in my sleep, and when I woke up, my heart was pounding, my skin clammy with sweat. The next day, we didn't talk about it, not at first. We all met up at the park, like we usually did, but there was this heaviness between us, this unspoken tension. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Do you think it's still there?" No one answered. None of us wanted to think about it, but we all were. I could see it in their eyes, the way they glanced at each other, the way they avoided looking at the direction of the old road that led back to that house. Over the next few weeks, things started to change. Tommy, the one who had always been the brave one, started acting strange. He stopped coming out with us, stopped answering his phone. When I did see him, he looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping. I asked him about it once, but he just shook his head, his eyes hollow. "It's nothing," he said, but I could tell it was a lie. It wasn't just Tommy either. We all felt it, that lingering presence, that cold dread that seemed to follow us wherever we went. Maria started having nightmares, and Sarah told me she kept hearing noises at night. Soft footsteps outside her window, the sound of something tapping on the glass. Luke tried to laugh it off, tried to pretend it didn't bother him, but I could see the fear in his eyes. One night, about a month later, I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. I didn't know why at first, but then I heard it, a sound from outside my window, a soft rustling, like something brushing against the wall of the house. I lay there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head to look at the window, and for a split second, I saw it, a shadow, dark and thin, slipping away into the night. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that before, the kind that grips you so tightly you can't move, can't breathe. I stayed awake the rest of the night, the lamp on, my eyes glued to that window, waiting for something to come back, praying that it wouldn't. The next day I called Tommy, but his mom said he wasn't feeling well, that he didn't want to see anyone. I went over anyway, and when I saw him, I barely recognized him. He looked pale, gaunt, like he hadn't eaten in days. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, like he was expecting to see something there. "It followed me home," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't get rid of it. It's always there, just watching." I didn't know what to say. There was nothing I could say. I just sat there, feeling that same cold dread creeping over me, the realization that whatever we had seen that night, whatever had been in that house, it wasn't finished with us. And it wouldn't be, not ever. We had gone looking for a thrill, for something to scare us, and we found it. But it wasn't the kind of fear you could laugh off afterward. It was the kind that stayed with you, that followed you, that crept into the corners of your life and never let go. Even now, I still feel it sometimes. Late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows seem to move on their own, I hear that soft rustling, that faint creak of footsteps, and I know it's still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. And that's what scares me the most, that maybe one day it'll come back for us, and this time it won't just be watching. I don't know if I've ever been more scared in my life than I was last winter. Even now, I still think about it, those details that I can't get out of my head, the things that still make me wonder if I was losing my mind or if something else was happening in that house. I never wanted to tell anyone about this because it sounds ridiculous when you try to explain it, but it's something I think I need to get off my chest. Maybe it'll make it easier for me to sleep at night. It all started when my parents decided to take a weekend trip to visit my aunt. It was supposed to be just them, kind of a romantic getaway, so I stayed home. I was in my last year of college, home on winter break, and I didn't mind having the house to myself. It's not like they were going far, and the plan was for them to be back by Sunday night. I even kind of liked the idea. I mean, who doesn't like having the whole place to themselves for a couple of days? It was the middle of January, and the cold had settled in deep. The kind of cold where even the air inside the house feels like it has an edge to it, and no matter how many layers you're wearing, it still creeps through. The wind was the worst. It howled outside, shaking the bare branches against the windows and making the walls creak. It had been like that for days, and I guess I just got used to it, the constant noise in the background like some low, ever-present hum. The first night wasn't anything special. I watched a few movies, made some microwave popcorn, and stayed up too late, typical when you have the place to yourself. I finally went to bed around 2 in the morning, feeling just the right mix of relaxed and drowsy. My bedroom is at the end of the hall, the door facing down the hallway that leads to the stairs. I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and soon enough, I was asleep. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe I had a weird dream, but suddenly, I was wide awake. My room was dark, only the faint glow from the streets outside filtering in through the curtains, and everything was quiet. Too quiet, actually, like the wind had stopped, leaving only this heavy, thick silence in its place. It took me a second to realize that something about the air felt different, like there was something waiting. I know it sounds strange, but it's hard to describe the feeling. Just this pressure in the room, like I wasn't alone anymore. I sat up, listening, and that's when I heard it, a soft sound from the hallway. Not the wind, not the usual creak of the house settling, but something else. It was faint, like the sound of fabric brushing against the wall, followed by the faintest tap, 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 like someone walking barefoot on the floorboards. My heart started pounding, my mouth going dry. I strained my ears, but the sound had stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, or maybe the wind. After a while, I managed to convince myself enough to lie back down, though my ears were still tuned for any noise, my eyes fixed on the door. It felt like forever before I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up groggy, the light already streaming in through the window. I remember getting out of bed and feeling this strange sense of dread, like I was forgetting something important. I shrugged it off, pulling on a hoodie before heading to the kitchen to make some coffee. As I walked down the hallway, I glanced toward my bedroom door, and that's when I saw them. Handprints. Right there, on the outside of my door, were these marks, smudged and greasy, like someone had pressed their hands flat against the wood. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach doing this weird little flip. They were faint but unmistakable. 2 handprints, each about the size of an adult's, one above the other, the fingers splayed wide. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at them. My brain couldn't quite process what I was seeing. I mean, who could have made those? The house had been locked up all night, and it was just me here. And they weren't my handprints. I hadn't touched the door like that, and even if I had, they wouldn't look like that. There was something wrong about them, something off about the proportions, the way the fingers seemed a bit too long, too slender. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe some smudges that had always been there, and I'd just never noticed. But I couldn't quite convince myself, and the longer I looked, the more certain I was that they hadn't been there the night before. I spent most of that day trying to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept busy, cleaning up the kitchen, watching TV, doing anything I could to keep my mind off those handprints. But every time I walked past my room, I'd find myself glancing at the door, and the sight of them would send that same chill through me. It wasn't just the prints themselves, it was the way they seemed to almost move in the shadows, like they were shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. That night, I double-checked every lock in the house, making sure all the windows were latched, every door locked tight. I even checked the attic door, though it hadn't been opened in years. Everything was secure, just like it had been the night before. I told myself that whatever had made those marks had to be something harmless, maybe even something explainable, like condensation or a trick of the light. But I still felt that unease creeping over me. I went to bed early, hoping that maybe if I just got some sleep, I'd wake up and everything would feel normal again. But that night, sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound made me sit up, my ears straining for any noise. I could hear the wind again, rattling the window panes, and the faint groan of the house settling in the cold. I tried to close my eyes, tried to think of something comforting, but all I could picture were those handprints, those long, thin fingers pressed against the wood. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. The same soft sound, like someone moving in the hallway, brushing against the walls. My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, but I could see the faint line of light under my door, the glow from the hallway nightlight. I watched it, my breath caught in my throat, and then, slowly, I saw the shadow. It moved across the line of light, slow, deliberate, like someone was standing just outside my door. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I lay there, completely still, my eyes glued to that thin strip of light. I could see it, this shadow that seemed to linger, as if whatever was out there was standing still, listening. I don't know how long I lay there, staring, not daring to move. Eventually, the shadow shifted, moved away, and the light under the door was clear again. I waited, listening for any sound, but the house was silent. Finally, I worked up the courage to move. I slowly reached over, turning on the lamp beside my bed, flooding the room with warm light. Nothing happened. The door stayed shut, and everything was still. I wanted to get up, to open the door and see if there was anything out there, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was too scared, too shaken by what I had seen. Instead, I stayed in bed, the light on, my eyes fixed on the door until exhaustion finally took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was morning again. The light was streaming in through the window, and everything looked normal, almost like none of it had happened. But when I finally got out of bed, I felt that same sense of dread settle over me. I walked over to the door, my heart pounding, and slowly opened it. The hallway was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, but when I turned to look at the outside of my door, the handprints were still there. Only now, there were more of them. 4 sets of handprints smeared across the wood, some overlapping, some higher up, like someone had been frantically pressing their hands against the door. My stomach turned, and I felt this wave of nausea wash over me. I knew right then that whatever had made those marks hadn't left. It was still here, somewhere in the house. I called my parents, trying to keep my voice steady. I made up some excuse about not feeling well, about wanting them to come home early. My mom could tell something was off, but she didn't press me. They promised to be back by that evening, and I hung up, feeling only slightly relieved. I spent the rest of the day in the living room, every light in the house turned on, my back to the wall so I could see every corner of the room. I didn't want to see if more handprints had appeared, or if there was something else waiting for me. The hours seemed to crawl by, each minute feeling like an eternity. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the time until my parents would be home. I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV, playing music, anything to drown out the silence of the house. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake that feeling, that creeping dread, the sense that I wasn't alone. It was late afternoon, the sun already beginning to set, when I heard it again, the sound from the hallway. This time it was louder, more deliberate, like someone was dragging their hand along the wall, slowly moving toward me. My heart started to race, and I turned off the TV, straining to hear. The sound stopped, replaced by silence, and I felt my entire body tense, every muscle frozen. Then I heard the doorknob to my bedroom slowly twist. The faint click as it turned, the soft creak of the door opening. My breath caught in my throat, and I stared at the hallway, waiting, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The door to my room was just out of sight, but I could hear it, hear the hinges groaning as it swung open. I wanted to get up, to run out of the house, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet were glued to the floor, my whole body paralyzed with fear. I listened, trying to hear if there were footsteps, but the house was completely silent, too silent. Then I saw it, just barely. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moved, dark and fleeting, just at the edge of the living room, near the hallway entrance. My heart felt like it stopped. I turned my head slowly, my eyes locked on the spot where I'd seen it. There was nothing there, just the dim light of the setting sun filtering in through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. I stood up, my legs trembling, and backed away toward the kitchen, my eyes still fixed on the hallway. I needed something, anything, to defend myself. I grabbed a knife from the drawer, holding it tight, the metal cold against my palm. My breathing was shallow, my whole body shaking, and I kept my back to the wall, moving slowly, trying to keep every corner in sight. I reached the kitchen table and just stood there, listening, waiting. The house was still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something just out of sight, watching me. I don't know how long I stood like that, maybe minutes, maybe longer. But then I heard it again. This time it was a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere down the hallway. It was my name. Just a whisper, barely there, like someone exhaling it into the stillness of the house. My blood ran cold, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't my imagination. I heard it, clear as day. My name, spoken softly, almost tenderly, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl, like it was mocking me. I couldn't stay there anymore. I needed to get out. I moved quickly, my eyes darting around the room, every shadow suddenly feeling like it was hiding something. I made my way to the front door, my hand fumbling with the lock, my fingers trembling so badly it took me a moment to get it open. Finally, I pulled the door wide, stepping out into the cold evening air, the wind biting at my face. I ran out onto the porch, slamming the door behind me, my heart still racing. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the driveway, the knife still clutched in my hand, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned back to look at the house, the windows dark, the front door closed. Everything looked normal, quiet, empty, but I knew better. I knew something was in there and it was waiting. I stood there, shivering in the cold, until I saw the headlights of my parents' car turning onto the street. Relief washed over me, and I ran toward them, waving them down. My mom rolled down the window, her face full of concern. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes wide as she looked at me, then at the knife in my hand. I couldn't even find the words to explain. I just shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. "There's something in the house." My dad frowned, looking past me at the house, then back at me. He didn't ask questions. He just parked the car and got out, walking toward the house, the keys in his hand. My mom stayed with me, her arm around my shoulders, trying to calm me down. I wanted to tell my dad not to go in, to just leave it, but he was already at the door, unlocking it, stepping inside. I watched, my heart in my throat, as he disappeared into the house. There was silence for a few moments, and then he called out, his voice echoing back to us. "There's nothing here, it's all fine." But I knew it wasn't. I could feel it, that presence still there, watching. My dad came back out a few minutes later, shaking his head. "I don't see anything." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "The handprints, they were on my door, and I heard something. I swear I heard it." He exchanged a glance with my mom, and I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he was trying to rationalize it. "We'll check it out in the morning, okay? Just come inside. You're safe now." But I didn't feel safe, not even with them there, not even with all the lights on. That night, I slept in the living room with my parents nearby, every light in the house blazing. I didn't close my eyes once. Every time I blinked, I could see that shadow, those long, smudged handprints on my door, and hear that soft whisper of my name. I knew that whatever had been there wasn't gone. It had just moved, hiding, waiting. The next morning, we went to check my room. The handprints were gone. Not a trace of them, not even a smudge. My dad said maybe I had imagined it, that the light had played tricks on me, but I knew better. I could still see them in my mind, those long fingers pressed against the wood, too thin, too deliberate. We never found out what it was, and my parents eventually stopped talking about it. But I couldn't. I moved out not long after that, found a place near campus, and tried to put it behind me. But every now and then, I still think about that night. I think about the way the shadow moved, the way my name was whispered in the dark, and the way the handprints kept multiplying, as if something was desperate to get in. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can still hear it. That soft rustling, the sound of bare feet on the floor, moving closer and closer and closer. And I wonder if one day I'll wake up to find those handprints again, only this time they won't be on the door. This time they'll be right next to me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget that night. It happened just a few months ago, and honestly, I've been replaying it in my mind over and over since then. I don't even know why I'm telling you this now. Maybe part of me just wants someone else to carry this memory with me, to convince myself it was real, or that I'm not going crazy. You might even think I'm just making this up, but this is exactly what happened to me. I was visiting my grandmother's old house. You know the type, one of those old New England homes with creaky floorboards and narrow hallways that seem to stretch forever when the lights are dim. She passed away last year, and no one had the heart to sell it yet. My mother said it was just too much work to clear everything out, so it ended up being left mostly untouched, filled with my grandma's things. Books, old furniture, family photographs on the walls. There was a warmth to the house, but also a kind of coldness since it had been abandoned. I offered to spend a weekend there, partly to check on it and partly just to, I don't know, remember her, I guess. The air was already turning chill as I pulled into the driveway that night. It was that deep autumn cold that feels like a precursor to winter, where the wind has teeth and the sky feels closer somehow, more oppressive. The house loomed over me, with its peaked roof and darkened windows that seemed to watch me as I approached. I remember noticing the way the branches of the old oak tree swayed, casting long, thin shadows against the front door like bony fingers reaching for something. But I brushed it off, just my imagination getting ahead of me, you know? I unlocked the front door, and the sound echoed in the silence. The air inside was stale, and it had that dusty, forgotten house smell. I went about turning on a few lights, and each switch I flipped seemed to struggle to ignite, as if even the electricity had grown sluggish in this untouched place. I dropped my bag by the foot of the staircase and walked into the living room. It was just as I remembered it. An old, sagging sofa, the glass front cabinet filled with trinkets, a large framed photograph of my grandmother on the mantel, smiling. I sat down, listening to the house. It creaked. The wind picked up outside, and somewhere a branch scraped against a window. I remember feeling a sudden chill, not just from the cold, but the kind that prickles your skin. I tried to shake it off, and I walked over to the fireplace. It hadn't been used in years, but I figured I could get a fire going. I found some old newspapers, bunched them up, and grabbed a few pieces of wood from the pile my grandfather used to keep. It took a while, but I eventually got a fire burning. It crackled softly, and the orange glow filled the room. I was staring into it, lost in thought, when I heard it. Just a faint noise, almost like a shuffle. I turned my head, listening carefully, but the house was quiet. Probably just the wind, I thought, trying to reassure myself. But something about it felt wrong. You know how sometimes you just know something's off? Like some instinct that comes from a place you can't quite explain. I shook my head, trying to forget it, and went to unpack a few things. I moved up the stairs, each step creaking louder than I remembered. The hallway upstairs was narrow, with doors on either side that led to the bedrooms. I walked to the room I always used to stay in. My grandma called it the blue room because of the faded blue wallpaper that still clung to the walls. I flicked the light switch, and it took a moment before the bulb flickered on, casting a weak yellowish glow. I was about to start unpacking my bag when I heard it again, this time closer, from downstairs. A soft sound, like someone shifting their weight on the old floorboards. My heart skipped a beat. I stood completely still, straining my ears. Silence. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe an animal had gotten in, or it was just the house settling. But I felt the unease creeping in, like cold fingers on the back of my neck. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. It just sort of faded into the emptiness of the house, and there was no answer. I walked out into the hallway, leaning over the banister to look down the stairs. The living room below was bathed in the flickering firelight, and everything seemed still. But then, I saw it. A shadow, moving across the far wall, just for a second. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the flickering of the fire. It was distinct, like someone passing in front of the flames. My heart pounded, and I felt the chill deepen. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct was telling me to stay upstairs, to lock the door and hide. But something else, maybe curiosity or fear of the unknown, pushed me forward. Slowly, I made my way down the stairs, each step sounding louder than the last. When I reached the bottom, I looked around. Everything was exactly as I left it, but the fire was burning lower, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker somehow. I walked into the kitchen, flipping the switch as I did. The harsh overhead light flickered on, and I scanned the room. Nothing. I exhaled, trying to calm myself. My nerves were just getting the better of me, I told myself. I turned to head back to the living room, and that's when I saw it. There, standing by the window, was a figure. Tall, draped in something white, almost like a shroud, but not quite. It was too smooth, like porcelain. Its face, if you could even call it that, was blank, just an expanse of white, and it was facing me. I couldn't tell if it had eyes, but I felt it looking at me. Studying me. The feeling was overwhelming, like every detail of my existence was being examined. My body froze. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stood there, staring at this thing. It didn't move, didn't shift, just stood, watching. Then, without warning, it began to glide toward me. Not walk, glide as if it wasn't touching the ground at all. My survival instinct finally kicked in, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling as I bolted out of the kitchen. I ran for the stairs, my legs feeling like they were moving through water, heavy and slow. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the pounding of my heart, but nothing else. No footsteps. No sound of pursuit. I reached my room, slamming the door shut behind me, and pressed my back against it, as if my weight alone could keep it closed. The house fell silent again, save for the distant crackle of the fire below. I listened, waiting for something, the sound of movement, the creak of a floorboard, but there was nothing. Minutes passed, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. Slowly, I moved away from the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the lock. I locked it, feeling only a tiny bit of relief as the bolt clicked into place. I stepped back, my eyes fixed on the door, half expecting it to burst open. But it didn't. The room was cold, the kind of cold that cuts through your clothes and seeps into your bones. I could see my breath now, small puffs of vapor in the dim light. The bulb overhead flickered, then dimmed, leaving me in near darkness. I backed away until I felt the bed against my legs, and I sank down, never taking my eyes off the door. And then, the handle turned. Slowly, deliberately, the brass knob twisted, rattling softly against the lock. I could hear it, a gentle, patient sound, as if whatever was out there wasn't in a rush. My heart was in my throat. I clutched at the blanket, pulling it up as if it could somehow shield me from whatever was on the other side. The rattling stopped. Silence. And then the softest whisper, right outside the door. It wasn't words, just a sound, like breath against the wood. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The knob released, and the house fell silent once again. I sat there staring at the door, waiting for something else, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. I don't know how long I stayed like that, maybe hours, maybe just minutes. Eventually, the exhaustion must have caught up with me, and I slumped back, falling into a restless, fitful sleep. When I woke up, it was morning. The light was weak, filtering in through the old curtains, but it was enough to make me feel like I'd survived something. I slowly got up, my whole body aching, and walked to the door. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking it and pulling it open. The hallway was empty. I made my way downstairs, my legs shaky, and everything was just as I was, just as I had left it. The fire in the living room had long since burned out, leaving only a few cold embers and a faint smell of smoke hanging in the air. The kitchen, too, was quiet, bright now in the morning light, with nothing out of place. It was almost as if the entire thing had been some twisted nightmare, a trick of my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The memory was too real, every detail too sharp to be dismissed so easily. I walked to the window where I had seen the figure standing the night before. The floor beneath it was just floor. No trace, no mark, no indication that anything had happened. But my body still felt the fear as if it was burned into my bones. I could still feel that deep, unsettling sensation of being watched, as if the figure had never really left. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just a figment of my imagination, that the stress of the house, the darkness, and the emptiness had played tricks on me. But the memory of the smooth, porcelain-like shape and the blank face lingered too strongly. I decided then that I couldn't stay in the house another night. Whatever it was, whether a spirit, a presence, or something beyond understanding, I knew I couldn't face it again. I packed my bag as quickly as I could, my hands trembling. As I moved through the house, I couldn't help but feel like every room I entered was somehow different, like the shadows seemed to cling to the corners a little too long, like the walls themselves were holding a secret I wasn't privy to. Once my bag was packed, I made my way downstairs, ready to leave. I turned off the lights, one by one, trying not to look too closely at the darkened corners as I went. When I reached the front door, I hesitated for just a moment, glancing back at the living room, at my grandmother's photograph still on the mantel. She looked happy, at peace. For a split second, I felt like maybe I was abandoning her, like I should stay. But then the memory of the night before surged back, and I turned, unlocking the door and stepping out into the cold morning air. The moment I was outside, I felt like I could breathe again. It was like I'd been holding my breath the entire time I was in that house, and only now, with the crisp, biting air around me, did I feel like I could finally exhale. I walked to my car, tossing my bag into the back seat, and got in. I took one last look at the house, with its old shingles and peeling paint, and that massive oak tree swaying in the wind. It looked ordinary, just an empty, aging house. But I knew better. As I drove away, I tried not to look back. The narrow road leading away from the house twisted through the woods, and soon enough the house disappeared behind me, swallowed up by the trees. I thought that would be it, that once I left, it would be over. But as the miles passed and the distance grew, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. It wasn't like I could see it, not in the rearview mirror, not anywhere along the road. It was just a feeling, deep in my gut, like something unseen was still watching, still studying me. That night, when I got home, I tried to relax. I took a long, hot shower, letting the steam fill the bathroom, and tried to tell myself that everything was okay now. The house was far behind me. Whatever was there couldn't have followed me. But when I stepped out of the shower, the mirror was fogged up, and for a moment I swear I saw something in the condensation. A shape, tall and white, behind me. I blinked, wiped the mirror, and it was gone. Just my mind playing tricks, I thought. Just the after effects of a restless night. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside made my eyes snap open. The hours ticked by, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the sensation that something was watching me. I tried to push the thoughts away, but that chill, that cold was still with me, lingering at the edge of my consciousness. And then, just as I was on the edge of sleep, I heard it. A soft, deliberate rattling sound like a doorknob being turned. My heart froze, and I lay there listening, not daring to move. The sound came again, soft but unmistakable, from the direction of my bedroom door. Slowly, my eyes shifted toward it, and my breath caught in my throat. The doorknob turned, just a tiny movement, barely perceptible, but enough. Enough to send a bolt of terror through me. Enough to make me realize that whatever had been in that house, whatever had stood by the window, had followed me. And it wasn't done yet. I bolted upright, flipping on the bedside lamp, and the light flooded the room. The doorknob stilled. Silence filled the space, pressing in on me. I got out of bed, my legs trembling, and moved toward the door, listening intently. My fingers hovered just above the knob, and I hesitated, feeling the cold metal beneath my skin. I knew that whatever lay beyond, I wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. Instead, I backed away, slowly, inch by inch, until I was back on my bed. I kept the lamp on for the rest of the night, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting, listening. And though nothing else happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond it, biding its time. I never went back to my grandmother's house after that. My family eventually cleared it out and sold it, and I didn't ask any questions. I didn't want to know if anyone else saw something, if anyone else heard the whispers or felt the eyes on them. I just wanted to forget, to pretend like it never happened. But even now, months later, I can't help but feel that cold, can't help but think that somewhere, that figure is still watching, still waiting. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind is howling and the house settles in the dark, I hear it. The soft, deliberate sound of a doorknob turning, of something shifting just out of sight. And I lie there, eyes open, heart pounding, waiting for the moment when I'll have to face it again. I need to tell you about something that happened last summer. It's one of those things that even now I can't shake off. We were just supposed to have a nice family vacation, something simple, you know? No big resorts, no crowded beaches, just a quiet getaway. We found this rental online, an old house near an isolated beach, far from any major town. My mom thought it would be quaint, like one of those old postcards of windswept dunes and secluded shores. The pictures made it look peaceful. What we found, though, was, well, not exactly what we expected. The drive to the house was the first sign. The directions took us along this narrow road that wound through a dense forest, and eventually, we broke out into open dunes, with sand stretching as far as we could see. It felt almost surreal, like we were stepping into another world. When we finally got there, the house was perched up on a slight hill, looking down over the beach. It was big, bigger than I expected, and had this almost colonial look, 2 stories with dark wood that had weathered badly under years of salty wind. It looked like it might have once been beautiful, but now it just seemed tired, almost defeated. We pulled up, and as soon as I stepped out of the car, I knew something was off. The air had this strange smell, like seaweed mixed with something metallic. And the beach, nothing like the pictures. The sand was strewn with trash, plastic bottles, rusted cans, even some tattered fishing nets. It was like no one had touched this place in years, and I couldn't help but wonder why. But still, we were there, so we tried to make the best of it. The first few days were okay, I guess. My family seemed to ignore the weird vibe. My parents were excited to just be away, and my little brother was happy exploring the dunes, running around, digging in the sand. But I got burned, really badly. On the second day, I forgot to reapply sunscreen, and by afternoon, my skin was bright red hot to the touch, stinging like it was on fire. So by day 3, I had to stay in the house while everyone else went out. I was pretty annoyed, trapped inside this old musty rental while they all got to enjoy themselves. But that's when things got weird. The house was cold, even during the day. I remember being downstairs, wrapped in a towel with the windows open, and there was this constant breeze coming from somewhere. It felt like it was sneaking in through cracks in the walls, chilling me to my bones, and it brought with it the sound of the sea, distant, almost echoing, like it was trying to get inside. I found myself listening to it, feeling like I was being lulled into something, some sort of trance. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the stillness of the place made it hard to concentrate. Later that afternoon, the sun began to set, and the house seemed to grow darker faster than it should have. The kind of darkness that doesn't just come from the absence of sunlight. It was deeper, like the shadows were seeping out from the corners of the room, expanding, swallowing the walls. I switched on the lights, but they barely did anything, just old, dim bulbs that made everything look yellowed, almost sickly. It was then that I noticed the noises. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, the way old places creak. But this was different. It started with a sound, soft, almost like the rustle of fabric coming from upstairs. I remember freezing, trying to figure out what it was. It wasn't my family. They were still down at the beach. I stood there in the middle of the living room, straining to hear. It came again, a slow, deliberate creaking, like someone taking a step across a wooden floor. My skin prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to go upstairs, partly because I needed to know, and partly because I was too stubborn to let myself get scared. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal that had gotten inside somehow. The staircase was narrow and steep, with each step groaning under my weight, and the air seemed even colder as I climbed. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched out in both directions, dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. I walked toward the room I had been sleeping in, the door halfway open. I paused, listening, and I swear I could hear breathing. Just the faintest sound, barely there, like someone drawing slow, shallow breaths. My heart started pounding, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. I took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The room was empty, but there was something different, something I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. The curtains were moving, just barely, and the window was closed. I walked over, touched the fabric. It was cold, almost damp, and it sent a shiver through me. I turned, scanning the room, and that's when I noticed it. The closet door was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it earlier, and now it was open, just a crack, like someone had been inside. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. It was such a stupid, cliché thing to do, opening a closet door in a dark, creepy house. But I had to. I had to prove to myself that it was nothing. I pulled it open in one quick motion, and nothing. Just darkness, clothes hanging limply, and a few old blankets stacked on the floor. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and laughed at myself, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment. But that feeling didn't last long. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, that rustling sound, but this time it was right behind me, coming from the direction of the bed. I spun around, my eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing there. I spun around, my eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing there. Just empty space and shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. I decided then that I needed to get out of that house, at least until my family came back. I went downstairs, grabbing a blanket to wrap around my sunburnt shoulders, and headed for the back door that led to the beach. When I stepped outside, the air felt thick, heavy, and the sky had darkened considerably. The moon was full, rising above the horizon, casting a pale light across the dunes, and I could see the outline of my family down by the water. I felt an overwhelming urge to get to them, to be near other people, to feel normal again. I started down the path, the sand cool beneath my feet, but every few steps I felt like I needed to look back to make sure the house was still behind me and that nothing was following me out. About halfway to the beach, I heard a noise, a sharp, distinct creak like the sound of the back door opening. I turned, and there, just at the edge of the porch, I thought I saw something. A figure, tall and thin, almost blending into the darkness of the house, like it was part of the shadow itself. My stomach dropped, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I blinked, and it was gone, the porch empty again. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, just my imagination running wild, but my legs didn't want to move anymore. I felt paralyzed for a moment, caught between the urge to run to my family and the dread of turning my back on the house. Finally, I forced myself to turn and keep walking, each step feeling slower than the last, my ears straining for any sound behind me. When I reached my family, I could barely speak. My mom looked at me, concerned, asking if I was okay, and I just nodded, trying to smile, trying to shake it off. I didn't want to ruin the trip. I didn't want them to think I was just being dramatic. But I couldn't shake that feeling, that deep, gnawing sense that something had followed me out of that house. We stayed out on the beach until it got late, the fire we built crackling and casting long, flickering shadows across the sand. I stayed close to the firelight, watching the house from a distance, its dark windows staring back at me. I tried to tell myself that everything was fine, that whatever I thought I saw was just my imagination. But when we finally went back, the unease only grew. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the moonlight streaming through the curtains, casting pale blue light across the room. Every creak of the house made me flinch, my eyes darting to the door, to the corners of the room where the shadows pooled. I kept telling myself it was just an old house, that old houses make noise, that there was nothing to be afraid of. And then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving down the hall, stopping right outside my door. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the door. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like the entire house was holding its breath with me. I stared at the thin line of light under the door, watching for any sign of movement. For a moment, I thought maybe it had stopped. Maybe I was just hearing things again. But then I saw it, a shadow shifting just beneath the door, blocking out the light for a split second. My heart started pounding, and every muscle in my body tensed. I wanted to call out, to say something, but my throat was dry and tight. I thought about my family just down the hall, sleeping soundly, completely unaware of what was happening. I reached over, slowly, trying not to make a sound, and grabbed the lamp from the nightstand. It was the only thing I could think of, something to defend myself, something solid to hold on to. The doorknob turned. I watched as it twisted, almost lazily, like someone on the other side was in no rush at all. The metal made a faint clicking noise, and then the door began to open, just an inch. I gripped the lamp tighter, feeling the cold metal against my fingers. I didn't want to see what was out there. I wanted to close my eyes, pull the covers over my head like a child, pretend none of it was real. But I couldn't look away. The door slowly swung open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. It was empty. No figure, no one standing there, but somehow that was worse. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, darker and more sinister, and I could hear the faintest rustling noise, almost like fabric brushing against the walls. I stood up, lamp in hand, and stepped towards the door. My legs felt weak, like they could give out at any moment, but I forced myself to move. I reached the doorway and leaned out, looking both ways down the hall. Nothing, just shadows and silence. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and whispered, "Hello?" My voice barely carried, swallowed by the darkness. Then, from downstairs, I heard it. A soft, drawn-out creak, like someone stepping slowly on an old floorboard. I felt my stomach drop. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, to close the door, lock it, and wait until morning. But something inside pushed me forward. I needed to know. I couldn't let whatever it was just wander the house, not with my family here. I stepped into the hallway, the floor cold beneath my feet. Each step felt like it took an eternity. I made my way toward the staircase, my heart pounding in my ears. The moonlight spilled in through the window at the end of the hall, casting pale light across the stairs. I could see down into the living room, the furniture just vague shapes in the dim light, and everything seemed still. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, trying to convince myself it was just the house, that it was nothing. And then I saw it. Down at the foot of the stairs, there was a figure, tall and thin, its form just barely visible in the dim light. It was standing perfectly still, facing me, though I couldn't make out any features. It looked like it was draped in something, cloth or maybe old seaweed, hanging loosely off its shoulders, and its face, there was something wrong about it. Blank, almost indistinct, as if it was nothing but a shadow pretending to be a person. I froze. My whole body locked up, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I gripped the lamp tighter, feeling like I was about to faint. The figure just stood there, not moving, not making a sound. It felt like an eternity, just staring at it, the dark shape at the bottom of the stairs. And then, slowly, it began to move. It didn't walk, not really. It almost floated, its feet gliding just above the ground as it began to make its way toward the kitchen. I could hear that faint rustle again, like fabric dragging across the floor. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but the sound was caught in my throat, stuck behind a wall of fear. I turned and ran back down the hallway to my parents' room. I burst through the door, finally finding my voice. "Mom! Dad! Wake up!" I whispered as loudly as I could, not wanting to draw attention but desperate for them to wake. They both stirred, my dad sitting up groggily, blinking at me. "What's going on?" he muttered, his voice still thick with sleep. "There's someone in the house," I said, my voice shaking. "I saw them downstairs. We have to get out now." My mom sat up, confused, her eyes widening as she registered what I said. My dad, always the practical one, rubbed his eyes, clearly trying to process. "Are you sure? It's probably just—" "No!" I cut him off, my voice trembling. "I saw it, Dad. We need to go." He looked at me, and I think something in my face must have convinced him. He nodded, swinging his legs out of bed. My mom got up too, and we all moved quietly down the hallway to my brother's room. He was still fast asleep, oblivious to everything. My mom gently shook him awake, whispering reassurances, and soon we were all standing together, unsure of what to do next. The stairs loomed ahead of us, the darkness below feeling like it was alive, like it was waiting. My dad led the way, moving slowly, trying not to make any noise. I stayed close to my mom, holding my brother's hand, feeling the tension like a weight pressing down on all of us. Each step creaked, the sound echoing through the silence of the house, and every moment I expected to see that figure again, waiting for us, watching us. We reached the bottom of the stairs, and my dad gestured for us to head to the door. He moved towards the kitchen, where we kept the car keys, and I felt my heart in my throat. He disappeared around the corner, and there was silence. Seconds passed, and they felt like hours. I strained to hear, every muscle in my body ready to run, and then, crash, the sound of something falling, glass shattering. My mom gasped, and I heard my dad shout, "Run! Get out of the house!" We didn't wait. My mom grabbed my brother and we ran for the front door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries before I got it open. We burst out into the night, the cold air hitting my face, and we ran down the path toward the car. My mom was yelling for my dad, her voice panicked, echoing across the dunes. And then I saw him. My dad, running out of the house, his face pale, eyes wide. He had the keys in his hand and he glanced back over his shoulder, his expression filled with a fear I had never seen before. He didn't say anything, just sprinted towards us, and I knew, whatever he had seen, it was real. It was right behind him. We piled into the car and my dad jumped into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking as much as mine had. The engine roared to life, and we sped away, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror, disappearing into the darkness. My mom was crying, holding my brother, and I sat there, staring back, waiting to see something, anything in the windows. But there was nothing, just the empty, dark silhouette of that awful place. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, a good 20 miles away. We pulled into a small motel, my dad practically throwing the car into park. We stumbled out, all of us shaken, exhausted, and went into the lobby. The clerk gave us strange looks, probably because we looked like we had just seen a ghost. My dad got us a room, and we spent the rest of that night huddled together, lights on, barely saying a word. In the morning, my dad wouldn't talk about what he saw in the kitchen, and I didn't press him. We packed up and left as soon as we could, heading straight home. We never went back to that beach, and none of us have mentioned that night since. But I still think about it. I think about the way that figure moved, the way the house seemed to breathe, seemed to watch. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear it again. The soft rustling of fabric, the creak of a floorboard, the feeling that somewhere, just out of sight, something is waiting, watching. And I know, deep down, that whatever it wasn't finished with us. It was just waiting for the right moment. And that's what scares me the most, that maybe one day